I kept my study locked for 12 years after my wife died. It was a shrine to her memory, a sanctuary completely off limits to everyone in the world. So when my son's wife decided to secretly copy my key, I was already one step ahead of them. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated against the nightstand. It was my son calling in a blind, breathless panic. "Dad," he stammered, his voice breaking with sheer terror. "Monica went into your study. She plugged something into your computer and now the whole network is locked out. Nothing is working." I did not yell. I did not ask for an explanation. I simply took a slow sip of my neat bourbon and replied in a dead, calm voice. "And the screen went black, and it is flashing a red countdown timer right now." Is it not? The dead silence on the other end of the line was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Harrison. I am 70 years old. I spent the first half of my life as a ruthless corporate auditor, ripping apart fraudulent ledgers, and the second half building a highly successful commercial real estate empire. I made my fortune by noticing the things other people tried to hide. I trusted numbers, patterns, and hard evidence, not tears or sweet words. When I lost my wife, Catherine, 12 years ago, my world stopped. I locked the heavy oak door to my home study because it still smelled of her perfume. I never allowed anyone inside. Not the housekeeper, not my son Bradley, and certainly not his wife Monica. Bradley is 42 years old, currently sitting as the vice president of acquisitions at my firm. He has always been a man who looks the part in a tailored suit, but beneath the expensive fabric, he is weak-willed and easily manipulated. Monica, on the other hand, is 38, razor-sharp, and dangerously impatient. She has spent the last 3 years playing the role of the perfectly devoted daughter-in-law, bringing me meals, asking about my health, and acting like the caretaker I supposedly needed as I entered my twilight years. I let her play her game. But the truth is, I never needed a caretaker. And I certainly did not need an enemy living under my own roof. To understand how we ended up on that midnight phone call, I need to take you back exactly 48 hours prior. It was a Tuesday evening. The house was quiet save for the low hum of the television while broadcasting the evening news in the background. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair, the same one I have sat in for a decade, reading through a thick stack of quarterly financial reports. Monica walked into the living room carrying a ceramic mug on a small silver tray. She had made a habit of brewing me chamomile tea every night before bed, claiming the warm herbal blend would help with my occasional insomnia. "Here you go, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness I had grown to tolerate. "Drink up. You have an early morning tomorrow, and you really need your rest." I thanked her, taking the warm mug from her hands. She lingered for a moment, busying herself with tidying up the magazines on the coffee table. Then she walked out into the main hallway to wipe down the antique console table near the front door. It was a perfectly mundane domestic scene. To an ordinary 70-year-old man, it would have looked like pure familial affection. But I was not an ordinary old man. 40 years of auditing teaches you to scan a room and spot discrepancies in a fraction of a second. My brain is hardwired to notice when a variable does not match the established baseline. From where I sat in the living room, I had a clear line of sight to that hallway console table. I watched Monica wipe the polished wood surface with a cloth. I watched her pause near the ornate glass bowl where I always dropped my everyday items. And then I noticed it. My keychain. It was resting flat on the mahogany surface. I am a creature of absolute rigid habit. Every single day for the past 12 years, when I walk through the front door, I drop my keys into the exact center of that glass bowl. It is an unbreakable reflex. I never miss the bowl. But right now, the keys were not inside the glass. They were resting on the wooden table exactly 2 inches to the left of the rim. Monica finished wiping the table, gave me one last polite smile from across the room, and went upstairs to the guest suite where she and Bradley were staying for the week, while their own house was supposedly undergoing plumbing renovations. I waited until I heard the soft click of their bedroom door closing upstairs. I did not move immediately. I took a slow sip of the chamomile tea, letting the warm liquid coat my throat. Then I set the mug down, stood up, and walked silently toward the hallway table. I looked down at the keys. I did not touch them yet. I simply leaned in closely under the warm glow of the hallway lamp. There were 5 keys on that silver ring. 4 of them were standard shiny silver keys for the vehicles and the front door. The 5th key was different. It was an old, heavy brass key, the only key in the world that unlocked the solid oak door of my study. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and slipped them on, bending closer to the brass key. The lighting illuminated the deep, intricate grooves cut into the metal. Packed tightly into the very bottom of those grooves was a microscopic layer of fine white powder. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, looking like nothing more than a bit of lint or everyday dust. But I knew exactly what it was. I carefully picked up the keyring by the metal loop, ensuring I did not brush against the brass key itself. I held it up to the light. The white residue was completely compacted into the jagged edges of the teeth. It was molding clay. Someone had taken my keys out of the glass bowl, pressed the heavy brass key firmly into a block of impression clay to capture its exact shape, and then hastily placed the keychain back on the table. They had been in such a rush that they missed the glass bowl by 2 inches and failed to wipe the residual clay dust from the grooves. A cold, sharp realization washed over me. You do not make a clay impression of a key unless you are planning to cut an illicit copy. And you do not cut a copy of a locked, forbidden room unless you intend to breach it. I stood alone in the quiet hallway of the home I had built, holding the physical proof of a betrayal. Most men my age would have marched right up those stairs, pounded on the guest room door, and demanded an explanation from their son and daughter-in-law. They would have yelled, threatened, and let their emotions dictate their actions. I did none of those things. I slipped the keys into my pocket, walked calmly back to my leather armchair, and picked up my mug of tea. I took another slow, deliberate sip. The predator was inside my house. My own daughter-in-law was actively plotting to break into my most private sanctuary. And my son, who had been unusually quiet and anxious all evening, was almost certainly in on the scheme. They thought I was just an aging, grieving widower who would not notice a few specks of dust or a misplaced keychain. They thought my mind was fading with age. They thought I was an easy target. But as I sat there in the silence of the night, a profound, unforgiving calmness settled over me. I had hunted corporate predators and financial criminals for decades. I knew exactly how to set a trap, and I knew exactly how to wait for the rats to take the bait. If Monica wanted to break into my study, I was going to let her. But I was going to make absolutely sure that when she finally opened that door, she would be stepping into a digital minefield that would rip her entire world apart. The morning sun crested over the manicured hedges of my estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway. I was already awake, having slept very little after the discovery in the hallway. My mind, trained by decades of forensic accounting, had been running probability models and risk assessments all night. I dressed in my usual attire, a pressed button-down shirt and tailored trousers, projecting the image of a man completely at ease with his world. I walked down the sweeping oak staircase and into the large kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed dark roast coffee filled the quiet air. That aroma mingled with the faint scent of the expensive floral perfume Victoria always wore. She was standing by the marble island, humming a quiet tune while slicing fresh fruit. Preston was notably absent, likely having already left for his morning squash game, or perhaps hiding from the sheer guilt of whatever they were planning. I poured myself a black coffee and sat on the leather bar stool directly across from her. I placed my keys on the counter. The metal produced a sharp clink against the stone. I let the silence stretch for a moment, sipping my hot, fresh coffee. She sliced a strawberry with the precision of a surgeon, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her had just categorized her as a hostile threat. "Good morning, Richard," she said, offering me a bright, flawless smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Did you sleep well?" I smiled back, matching her fabricated warmth perfectly. I slept wonderfully, Victoria. The chamomile tea you prepared was incredibly soothing. She nodded, clearly pleased with herself, and turned to place the bowl of fruit in front of me. As she did, her gaze flicked downward for a fraction of a second. Her eyes landed on the keychain resting near my coffee mug. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny twitch of the optic nerve, but it was all the confirmation I needed. She recognized the keys. She knew exactly what she had done the night before. I reached out and picked up the keyring, dangling it loosely from my index finger. The heavy brass key for the study caught the morning light, illuminating the faint white residue packed deeply into its ancient grooves. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the cool marble, and let out a soft, heavy sigh. "You know, the strangest thing happened this morning," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. I was grabbing my keys from the hallway table, and I noticed they were covered in some sort of strange white dust. It almost looks like dried powder or perhaps a bit of hardened clay packed into the metal teeth. I rubbed my thumb over the brass key, making sure she saw the deliberate motion. I cannot for the life of me figure out how they got so dirty, just sitting in the glass bowl. I paused, letting the heavy silence hang right there. I kept my eyes locked directly onto her face, watching for the inevitable physiological tells of deception. Her breathing halted for a split second. The steady rhythm of her knife against the cutting board stopped. Her pupils dilated slightly, a natural autonomic response to sudden stress. But Victoria was a seasoned manipulator. She recovered with terrifying speed. She let out a small, self-deprecating gasp and raised a hand to her chest, widening her eyes in a display of perfectly manufactured guilt. "Oh my goodness, Richard!" she exclaimed, her voice pitching up slightly to convey a pure and innocent surprise. "I am so incredibly sorry. That was entirely my fault." She set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel, stepping closer to the counter with a look of deep apology. "I was dusting the hallway console table yesterday afternoon, and I accidentally knocked your keys onto the floor. My open makeup bag was sitting right there on the bench, and the keys fell straight into my setting powder. I tried to wipe them clean before you came home, but I must have missed some of the powder in those deep grooves. Please forgive my utter, absolute clumsiness." It was a brilliant, highly calculated lie. It provided a completely logical explanation for the white residue, framing it as a harmless cosmetic product rather than industrial impression clay. It also explained why the keys had been moved slightly from their usual spot inside the glass bowl. If I were truly a declining, clueless old man, I would have accepted the excuse without a second thought. But she did not stop there. Victoria knew that a good lie requires an emotional anchor to distract the target from the logical inconsistencies. She leaned in, her voice softening with perfectly faked warmth. "The truth is, Richard Vong, I was actually looking for something special when I knocked them over. I wanted to keep it a secret, but I suppose I have to tell you now." She reached out and gently touched my arm, deploying a tactile gesture designed to disarm my defenses. "Your 71st birthday is coming up next month. Preston and I wanted to do something incredibly meaningful for you. I know how much you miss Mary. We were hoping to find her old photo albums, the ones with the pictures from your honeymoon and the early company days spent together. We wanted to digitize all of those precious memories and put them into a beautiful digital frame for your desk. I thought the albums might be locked away in your study, so I was looking around the hallway to see if I could find a spare key. I did not mean to snoop, I just wanted to surprise you with a piece of Mary." The audacity of her words struck me like a physical blow. She was using the sacred memory of my dead wife as a shield for her own criminality. It was a masterful, predatory, emotional, psychological manipulation. It was designed to weaponize my grief and force me to back down. But beneath the sickening sweetness of her emotional performance, my auditor mind instantly detected a fatal, glaring flaw in her story. The photo albums of Mary are not in the study. They have never been in the study. When Mary passed away 12 years ago, I could not bear to look at those photographs every single day. I carefully packed all the albums into 3 waterproof plastic bins and stored them safely in the climate-controlled section of the massive attic. Preston absolutely knows this simple fact. Victoria also knows this fact because she explicitly asked me about those exact albums 2 Christmases ago, and I told her precisely where they were located. The lie was not a simple mistake. It was a deliberate, highly calculated psychological test. Victoria was purposefully feeding me false information about the location of the most treasured belongings belonging to my late wife. She was watching my reaction to see if my memory was beginning to fail. If I accepted her story and agreed that the albums were in the study, it would confirm to her that I am losing my mind. The morning sun crested over the manicured hedges of my estate, casting long and sharp shadows across the driveway. I was already awake, having slept very little after the discovery in the hallway. My mind, trained by decades of forensic accounting, had been running probability models and risk assessments all night long. I dressed in my usual attire, putting on a pressed button-down shirt and tailored trousers, projecting the image of a man completely at ease with his world. I walked down the sweeping oak staircase and moved silently into the large kitchen, preparing for war. The smell of freshly brewed dark roast coffee filled the quiet air, mingling with the faint scent of the expensive floral perfume Victoria always wore. She was standing by the marble island, humming a quiet tune while slicing fresh fruit. Preston was notably absent, likely having already left for his morning squash game, or perhaps hiding from the sheer guilt of whatever they were planning. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat on the leather bar stool directly across from her, ready to execute the very first phase of my carefully calculated counterattack. She sliced a strawberry with the precision of a surgeon, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her had just categorized her as a hostile threat. "Good morning, Richard," she said, offering me a bright and flawless smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I smiled back, matching her fabricated warmth perfectly. "I slept wonderfully." "Victoria," I replied smoothly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keyring, letting it dangle loosely from my index finger. I placed the keys onto the marble counter, letting the heavy metal produce a sharp, deliberate clink. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the cool stone, and let out a soft and heavy sigh. "You know, the strangest thing happened this morning," I said, keeping my tone light and entirely conversational. I was grabbing my keys almost from the hallway table, and I noticed they were covered in some sort of strange white dust. It almost looks like dried powder, or perhaps a bit of hardened clay packed into the metal teeth. I rubbed my thumb over the brass key, making absolutely sure she saw the motion. "I cannot figure it out." I kept my eyes locked directly onto her face, watching for the inevitable physiological tells of deception. Her breathing halted for a split second. The steady rhythm of her knife against the cutting board stopped completely. Her pupils dilated slightly, a natural autonomic response to sudden, unexpected stress. But Victoria was a seasoned manipulator, and she recovered with terrifying speed. She let out a small, self-deprecating gasp and raised a hand to her chest, widening her eyes in a display of perfectly manufactured guilt. "Oh my goodness, Richard," she exclaimed, her voice pitching up slightly. "I am so incredibly sorry," she continued, her tone dripping with an expertly crafted innocence. "That was entirely my fault." She set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel, stepping closer to the counter with a look of deep apology. "I was dusting the hallway console table yesterday afternoon, and I accidentally knocked your keys onto the floor. My open makeup bag was sitting right there on the bench, and the keys fell straight into my setting powder. I tried to wipe them clean, but I must have missed some deep grooves. It was a brilliant and highly calculated lie. It provided a completely logical explanation for the white residue, framing it as a harmless cosmetic product rather than industrial impression clay. It also explained why the keys had been moved slightly from their usual spot inside the glass bowl. If I were truly a declining, clueless old man, I would have accepted the excuse without a second thought. But she did not stop there. Victoria knew that a good lie requires an emotional anchor to distract the target from the logical inconsistencies. She leaned in closer now. Her voice softened with perfectly faked warmth and a hint of gentle hesitation. The truth is, Richard Y. was actually looking for something special when I knocked them over. I wanted to keep it a secret, but I suppose I have to tell you now. She reached out and gently touched my arm, deploying a tactile gesture designed to disarm my psychological defenses. Your 71st birthday is coming up next month, and Preston and I really wanted to do something incredibly meaningful for you this year. I know how much you desperately miss Mary. We were hoping to find her old photo albums, she said softly, staring into my eyes with an expression of profound, synthetic empathy. The ones with the pictures from your honeymoon and the early company days spent together. We wanted to digitize all of those precious memories and put them into a beautiful digital frame for your desk. I thought the albums might be locked away in your study, so I was looking around the hallway to see if I could find a spare key. I did not mean to snoop around your private things. I just wanted to surprise you with a piece of Mary, she concluded, withdrawing her hand as if she felt deeply ashamed of her own kindness. The absolute audacity of her words struck me like a physical blow to the chest. She was using the sacred memory of my dead wife as a tactical shield for her own criminality. It was a masterful and predatory emotional manipulation, designed entirely to weaponize my lingering grief and force me to back down out of sheer gratitude. Beneath the sickening sweetness, my mind instantly detected the fatal flaw. The photo albums of my beloved Mary are not inside the locked study. They have never been in that room. When my wife passed away 12 years ago, I could not bear to look at those photographs every single day. I carefully packed all the heavy albums into 3 waterproof plastic bins and stored them safely in the climate-controlled section of our massive attic. The study contains nothing of emotional value. It is filled strictly with 12-year-old corporate paperwork and a heavy-duty wall safe holding my most valuable assets and private ledgers. Victoria knows this simple fact. She knows it because she explicitly asked me about those exact same albums 2 Christmases ago, and I told her precisely where they were located in the attic. Her lie was not a simple mistake or a desperate excuse to cover her tracks. It was a deliberate, highly calculated psychological test designed to probe the current state of my cognitive health. Victoria was purposefully feeding me false information about the location of my late wife and her treasured belongings, just to see if my memory was beginning to fail under the weight of my advancing age. If I accepted her story without raising a single objection, it would immediately confirm to her that I was truly losing my mind, proving that I had become a weak old man who could not defend himself, and that her wicked plan could proceed without any resistance. I allowed a gentle smile to spread across my face. I looked at Victoria with the warmth of a grateful father-in-law. "That is incredibly thoughtful of you, Victoria," I said, making sure my voice carried a slight tremor of manufactured emotion. Mary loved those early days of the company, and having those pictures digitized would be a wonderful birthday gift. You do not need to worry about the keys at all. Leave the albums for now, and perhaps I will look for them myself when I have free time this weekend. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow sip, maintaining complete eye contact. She exhaled softly, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as the immediate tension left her body. She truly believed she had won. She believed her manipulation had worked perfectly. I finished my coffee, thanked her for the fresh fruit, and walked out of the kitchen with the slow and deliberate steps of an aging man. But as I turned the corner into the main hallway, the warm smile vanished from my face entirely. My instincts, honed by decades of corporate warfare, were screaming like alarm bells in my mind. I walked toward the front door, stopping briefly to look at the heavy oak door of my locked study. I needed to understand her true motivation. Why the sudden desperate interest in a room that had remained untouched for 12 long years? The study was not a museum of sentimental family artifacts. It was a sterile, highly secure environment. The walls were lined with heavy filing cabinets containing thousands of pages of complex commercial real estate contracts, land deeds, and corporate tax records. Behind my heavy mahogany desk, hidden seamlessly into the reinforced wall, was a massive biometric and combination safe. That safe held my private offshore ledgers, my most sensitive financial instruments, and my estate planning documents. There was absolutely nothing in that room a 38-year-old woman would want for a simple birthday surprise. The only things inside that room were the keys to my entire financial empire. Victoria was not looking for memories. She was hunting for assets. I stepped into the cool morning air, walking slowly toward my car. As I drove to the corporate office, I began to rigorously analyze Victoria's behavior over the past few weeks. In forensic auditing, you do not just look at missing money. You look at the behavioral anomalies of the people handling the accounts. Suddenly, a dozen seemingly innocent interactions took on a deeply sinister meaning. I remembered how meticulously Victoria had been tracking my personal calendar. She asked my secretary to forward my daily itineraries to her phone, claiming she wanted to make sure I was not working too late into the evening. I also recalled her sudden, intense interest in my medical appointments. Just last Tuesday, she had casually asked me about the results of my annual physical examination. She specifically inquired if my doctor recommended any cognitive memory tests, framing the question as normal concern for a man my age. She even offered to accompany me to my next cardiology appointment to take notes. She was actively gathering detailed intelligence on my physical whereabouts and mental state. She needed to know exactly when I would be out of the house, and she needed to establish a baseline of my overall health. The pieces of the puzzle were snapping together with terrifying clarity. Victoria was planning a major financial strike against my estate, but she needed access to the foundational documents locked inside my study. However, she could not simply kick the door down. She needed uninterrupted time. She needed a clear window of opportunity to breach the room, search the extensive files, and attempt to crack the combination on my wall safe. If she felt confident enough to make a physical clay impression of my keys, she was already moving into the active phase of her operation. I could not simply wait for her to make her next move. Waiting is a passive strategy, and passive men do not survive in my industry. I needed to force her hand. I needed to control the timeline and dictate the conditions under which she would launch her attack. I needed to provide her with an irresistible decoy, an opportunity so perfect that she would abandon her usual caution and walk straight into my trap. By the time I returned home that evening, my plan was formulated. I walked into the formal dining room where Preston and Victoria were seated at the long mahogany table, finishing their glasses of red wine. I took my seat at the head of the table, letting out a loud and exhausted groan. I placed my napkin on my lap and looked at my son. "Preston," I said, letting my voice sound weary and tired, "I am feeling completely burnt out. The commercial zoning negotiations this week have drained my energy. I think I need a break from the city. I am going to take a spontaneous 3-day weekend and head down to the Florida Keys for a fishing trip. I will leave tomorrow afternoon and will not be back until late Sunday night. I need you to handle the final closing on the downtown Plaza property while I am off the grid and unreachable." I watched my son very closely as the words left my mouth. I wanted to see a look of concern. I wanted to see him offer to come with me or suggest that I stay home and rest instead of taking a sudden flight. I desperately wanted to see genuine paternal affection from the boy I had raised and provided for his entire life. But that is not what happened. The visible and immediate relief that washed over Preston's face was absolutely sickening. His shoulders slumped forward, releasing a massive amount of tension. He quickly glanced across the table at Victoria, a rapid, highly communicative look that lasted only a fraction of a second. It was a look of pure victory. Victoria smiled back at him, her eyes practically shining with predatory excitement. Preston turned his attention back to me, masking his joy with a look of dutiful obedience. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Dad," he said smoothly. "You have been working too hard lately. You deserve some time on the water. Do not worry about the plaza closing. I will handle everything here at the office. You just focus on relaxing and catching fish. Have a great trip." That single fleeting glance between husband and wife was the final nail in the coffin. It eradicated any lingering doubts I harbored about my son. Preston was not an innocent bystander. He was not being blindly manipulated by a cunning wife. He was fully and entirely complicit in whatever dark scheme they had engineered against me. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had groomed to inherit my entire empire, was actively conspiring to tear me down. I nodded slowly, thanking him for his hard work. I finished my dinner in silence, chewing my food mechanically, as a cold, unforgiving fire ignited deep inside my chest. The following afternoon, I carried my bag down the staircase dressed in my casual fishing attire. Preston and Victoria waited by the front door. They played the loving family perfectly. Victoria handed me a travel mug filled with her signature chamomile tea, insisting I drink it to keep my nerves calm. Preston clapped my shoulder, telling me to catch a fish. I accepted the tea, hugged my son, and walked out to my vehicle. As I backed out of the winding driveway, I watched them wave. I knew the moment my car disappeared from their sight, their smiles would vanish, and the hunt would begin. I did not drive toward the international airport. Instead, I took the highway heading straight toward the industrial outskirts of the city. I navigated through dilapidated warehouses until I reached a rundown cash-only motel sitting entirely off the grid. It was the kind of place where questions were never asked. I paid for a 3-day stay using crisp $100 bills parked behind a rusted dumpster and carried my bag into a dimly lit room that smelled of stale tobacco. I locked the deadbolt, closed the blackout curtains, and set my laptop onto the cheap veneer desk. I did not need a fishing rod this weekend. I was hunting a different kind of prey. I sat down on the creaking chair and opened my computer. 10 years ago, paranoid about corporate espionage, I hired a private security firm to install covert motion-activated microcameras inside my home study. The lenses were hidden flawlessly inside the spine of a hollowed-out, leather-bound book and the ventilation grate. I typed in a sequence of encrypted IP addresses and entered my master password. The screen flickered before pulling up a live, high-definition feed of my locked study. Now all I had to do was wait. I opened the travel mug Victoria had given me and poured the chamomile tea straight down the bathroom sink, rinsing the basin carefully. I sat back down at the desk and kept my eyes locked on the screen. The wait was agonizingly short. Barely 2 hours after I had supposedly left for the airport, a silent red alert flashed across my laptop screen. Motion detected. The heavy brass lock on the study door turned with a loud metallic clink. The door swung open, and Preston stepped inside, followed immediately by Victoria. They did not hesitate. There was no casual snooping and no looking around for misplaced photo albums. They moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of professional thieves. Victoria walked past the bookshelves and went directly behind my heavy mahogany desk. She began yanking the drawers open, rifling rapidly through the hanging file folders and tossing irrelevant paperwork onto the expensive rug. Preston walked directly to the reinforced wall safe. He crouched down, wiping a thin layer of sweat from his forehead, and began spinning the heavy mechanical dial. I turned the audio feed up to maximum volume, pressing my headphones against my ears. I could hear the frantic rustling of paper and the clicking of the safe mechanism. "Come on," Preston muttered under his breath, spinning the dial in visible frustration. "Try his birth year again," Victoria snapped, not looking up from the documents. "I already tried his birth year, his anniversary, and the day Mom died." Preston replied, his voice pitching higher. "None of them work. The old man is losing it, but he still changes his passwords." Hearing my own son casually refer to me as a declining old man sent a wave of cold fury coursing through my veins. He sounded so profoundly annoyed that I had not left my financial empire completely unprotected for him to plunder. But the anger was quickly eclipsed by a much darker, far more terrifying revelation. Victoria slammed a drawer shut with a vicious degree of force, making Preston jump. "If we do not find the offshore crypto ledgers and his medical proxy forms by Monday, we are dead." Victoria hissed, her voice vibrating with venomous panic. "We need those ledgers, Preston. We need the account numbers." Preston wiped his face, looking terrified. "I know. "I know," he stammered defensively. "But we still have time. He will not be back until Sunday night. We can keep searching. We can hire a professional safecracker if we have to." "We do not have time, Preston." Victoria growled, marching across the room and pointing a finger directly at his chest. "The syndicate is not going to wait. And more importantly, the doctor said the neurosuppressants are building up in his system much faster than we initially projected." My blood turned to absolute ice. I stopped breathing. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my hands gripping the edge of the cheap motel desk so hard my knuckles turned stark white. "He is already showing signs of confusion." Victoria continued, her tone chillingly clinical. "Did you see how easily he accepted the lie about the photo albums this morning? He bought it completely. The chemicals are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. If we can secure the medical proxy forms and force him to sign them this weekend, we can declare him legally and medically incompetent by next week. We will have complete total control over the entire estate." The words echoed through the dark motel room like a death sentence. The chamomile tea, the warm herbal blend she had been meticulously brewing for me every single night for the past 3 months. She had not been caring for my insomnia. She had not been playing the role of a devoted daughter-in-law. She had been slowly, methodically poisoning me. She was slipping powerful neurosuppressants into my daily routine to artificially induce the debilitating symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. They were deliberately destroying my cognitive function to steal my life's work. I sat back in the chair, my chest heaving, as the sheer magnitude of their betrayal crashed over me. They were not just trying to embezzle corporate funds or steal offshore accounts. They were actively orchestrating a medical assassination. They intended to strip away my mental faculties, force me into chemical dependency, lock me away in a sterile psychiatric facility, and steal the empire I built with my late wife. I pulled the headphones away from my ears and stared at the live feed. My son was still trying to crack the safe, completely complicit in a plot to destroy his own father's mind. I was no longer dealing with simple, greedy relatives or an inheritance dispute. I was now fighting a desperate battle for my literal home. The realization washed away any remaining trace of paternal affection. Preston and Victoria had officially crossed a dark line from which there could be no return. They had declared total war, relying on my supposed weakness and fading memory to execute their flawless crime. But they had vastly underestimated the man they were trying to kill. I reached into my bag, pulled out my mobile phone, and dialed a number. It was finally time to introduce them to a living nightmare they could never begin to fully comprehend. I pulled the mobile phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had hoped I would never need to use for a family matter. Thomas is a man who operates entirely without sentiment or emotional hesitation. He is my lead corporate attorney, a ruthless legal strategist who views all human relationships through the cold and unforgiving lens of liability leverage and asset protection. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, alert, and thoroughly professional. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or unnecessary background information. I told him absolutely everything. I detailed the unauthorized entry into my private space, the desperate attempted safe cracking by my son, and the horrific venomous conversation regarding the neurosuppressants and the forged medical proxy. Thomas did not gasp. He did not express any personal shock or moral outrage. He simply asked me what my immediate operational parameters were and how I wanted to proceed. I instructed him to immediately assemble a specialized legal strike team and freeze any unauthorized movement on all my corporate accounts. I also told him I needed the specialized digital device his private investigator had mentioned during a previous corporate espionage case we handled 5 years ago. I needed a custom-built Trojan virus, highly weaponized, undetectable, and ready to deploy by noon tomorrow. Thomas told me he would have it couriered directly to my motel room in exactly 12 hours. He warned me that we needed to go to the federal authorities right away given the poisoning attempt. I refused his advice completely. I told him I needed to control the blast radius before I detonated the bomb. I needed to see the entire board before I made my final move. The next morning, precisely at noon, a blank manila envelope arrived at the motel front desk. Inside was a sleek, shiny black USB drive. It looked like a standard encrypted storage device you could buy at any electronics store, but it was a digital predator. Thomas had assured me that the moment it was plugged into a host computer, the malware would silently bypass all standard firewalls, clone the entire hard drive in the background, and transmit every single byte of data to a secure cloud server under my exclusive control. I took a piece of heavy white adhesive tape and carefully labeled the drive. I took a black pen and wrote the words Global Assets and Crypto Ledgers 2025 in clear, bold letters. It was the exact phrase Victoria had desperately whispered to Preston the night before. It was the perfect, irresistible bait. Now I just needed to place the trap inside the cage. I opened my laptop and pulled up the shared digital calendar Preston and Victoria meticulously maintained to track my movements. They had a lengthy lunch meeting scheduled at an upscale downtown restaurant with a prominent landscape architect, supposedly to discuss their new home renovations. I waited until the GPS tracker on my company vehicle, which Preston was currently driving, confirmed they had parked downtown. The moment they sat down for their expensive lunch, I left the motel and drove straight back to my own estate. I parked my car a full block away, walking up the side path to avoid triggering the primary driveway security sensors. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the suffocating, heavy silence of the house. The faint scent of chamomile tea still hung stubbornly in the air, a sickening reminder of the poison I had been blindly consuming under the guise of familial care. I walked straight past the kitchen and stood before the heavy oak door of my study. I retrieved the brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a satisfying mechanical click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the sanctuary. The room was exactly as I had left it 12 years ago, except for the subtle telling signs of their frantic, desperate search the night before. A few file folders were slightly misaligned in the cabinets. The corner edge of the Persian rug was folded over where Preston had paced. I walked around the massive mahogany desk and crouched down in front of the reinforced wall safe. I placed my thumb against the biometric scanner and spun the mechanical dial with practiced, rhythmic ease. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside sat neatly stacked bundles of outdated tax returns, sealed corporate ledgers, and original property deeds. There were absolutely no cryptocurrency codes. There were no medical proxy forms. The fortune they were looking for was securely locked in a blind trust at a major financial institution, not sitting in a wall safe in a suburban home. I took the shiny black USB drive from my shirt pocket and placed it right in the dead center of the safe, resting it prominently on top of a stack of blank legal documents. The bright white label stood out starkly against the dark interior metal. It was absolutely impossible to miss. I stood up and looked around the room, making sure my presence would not be suspected. But then I paused, letting my auditor mind run the scenario to its logical conclusion. If I closed the safe completely and locked the study door, they would be forced to start their desperate search all over again. They might hire that professional safecracker Preston had mentioned in his panic. They might destroy the room and force a physical confrontation. I needed to hand them the victory on a silver platter. I needed them to truly believe that the drugs were rapidly destroying my mind and that I was making catastrophic, careless mistakes due to cognitive decline. I reached down and gently pushed the heavy steel door of the safe until it was almost completely closed, leaving a glaring 2-inch wide open gap. The metal locking bolts remained retracted. It looked exactly like the careless, absent-minded mistake of a senile old man who had completely forgotten to spin the dial. I left the study pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me, but I purposefully did not turn the brass key to lock it. I walked back through the silent hallway and stepped out into the afternoon sun, letting the front door click firmly shut. Every single action I had taken today was a calculated risk, but it was entirely necessary to force their hand. I returned to my vehicle and started the engine, gripping the leather steering wheel as a wave of dark anticipation washed over me. My son and his deceitful wife were currently sitting in a fine dining establishment, eating expensive food paid for, with my money, plotting exactly how they were going to erase my mind and steal my life. They truly believed they were the apex predators in this house. They thought I was just a weak victim waiting for the slaughter. But when they returned home today, they would find the golden ticket sitting right inside that cracked safe. The bait was set. The snare was open. All that remained was for the rats to finally take their very last bite of the cheese sealing their fate. I stood perfectly still in the center of the quiet study. The trap was laid flawlessly. The heavy steel door of the wall safe was cracked open just enough to invite curiosity. The black drive rested inside like a dormant viper. I took one final look around the room to ensure nothing else was out of place. I adjusted a stray file folder on my mahogany desk and smoothed out the edge of the Persian rug. The silence in the house was absolute. It provided a false sense of complete security. I turned to walk toward the exit of the room, mentally calculating my route back to the hidden motel. But then the silence was shattered. The heavy brass lock on the front door turned with a loud and echoing clink. The hinges whined softly. Someone had just walked into the house. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a physical blow. The blood rushed in my ears. I glanced at my watch. It was only 1:30 in the afternoon. Preston and Victoria were supposed to be at a high-end restaurant downtown, navigating a 3-hour design consultation for their renovations. They never returned home this early. But the heavy and frantic footsteps echoing across the marble foyer told a completely different story. It was not Victoria. The heavy and hurried stride belonged exclusively to my son. I was trapped. The study is situated directly off the main hallway. If I stepped out of the heavy oak door now, I would walk right into him. I could not simply explain away my presence. I was supposed to be halfway to the Florida Keys by now. If Preston saw me standing here, the entire illusion of my cognitive decline would evaporate instantly. He would know I was onto them. The element of surprise, my greatest tactical advantage, would be lost forever. I had mere seconds to make a decision. I backed away from the main door, my shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. At the far corner of the study sits a small and windowless bathroom I had installed decades ago for late nights working on corporate audits. I moved swiftly toward it, stepping inside and pulling the door shut behind me. I did not close it completely. I left a fraction of an inch open so I could hear and see into the study. The bathroom was pitch black. I stood perfectly motionless in the dark, controlling my breathing, forcing my lungs to take slow and shallow intakes of air. The footsteps grew louder approaching the study. I could hear Preston muttering frantically to himself. The heavy oak door of the study, which I had deliberately left unlocked, creaked open. Preston stumbled into the room. Through the narrow crack in the bathroom door, I watched my son. He looked absolutely wretched. His expensive tailored suit jacket was discarded, his tie was loosened, and his shirt was damp with sweat. He was holding his mobile phone tightly against his ear, pacing back and forth across the Persian rug like a caged animal. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with sheer panic. He did not even glance at the cracked wall safe or the black drive resting inside. He was entirely consumed by the voice on the other end of the phone line. "Listen to me," Preston pleaded, his voice trembling with a level of raw terror I had never heard from him before. "I told you I just need a little more time. You have to give me until next week." The person on the other end of the line spoke. I could not hear their words, but the tone was low and guttural and deeply threatening. Preston stopped pacing. He ran a shaking hand through his hair, his face turning incredibly pale. "No, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking violently. "Do not go anywhere near Victoria. Do not touch my wife. I swear to you on my life I will get you the money. The old man just left for the weekend. The process is already in motion. We are finalizing the medical proxy right now. I will have the deed to the downtown commercial plaza transferred into your holding company by Monday morning. I promise you will get everything you are owed." I stood frozen in the suffocating darkness of the bathroom. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The downtown commercial plaza is the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio. It is a prime piece of urban property worth tens of millions of dollars. Preston was not just talking to a greedy business partner or a shady corporate competitor. He was negotiating for his physical safety. He was begging for the physical safety of his wife. You do not beg a bank to spare your wife. You beg a violent criminal syndicate. My son had gotten himself involved in something far more dangerous than simple embezzlement. He was in deep and catastrophic debt to people who broke bones and ruined lives for a living. He was trying to use my flagship property to buy his way out of a lethal situation. The stakes had just skyrocketed from a simple family betrayal to a matter of imminent and violent danger. Preston listened to the voice on the phone for another long and agonizing moment. He nodded rapidly, even though the caller could not see him. Understood, Preston whispered, his voice completely defeated. "Monday morning. You will have the deed. I will not fail you again." He ended the call and let his phone drop onto the mahogany desk. He leaned over, gripping the edges of the desk, burying his face in his arms. He let out a ragged and desperate sob. For a brief and fleeting moment, a wave of paternal instinct washed over me. I wanted to step out of the darkness. I wanted to put my hand on his shoulder, ask him what kind of terrible trouble he was in, and offer to fix it. I had spent my entire life fixing his mistakes. I had bought his way out of every consequence he had ever faced. But then I remembered the truth. I remembered the white clay packed into the grooves of my brass key. I remembered the hidden neurosuppressants in my evening tea. I remembered the cold and clinical way Victoria had discussed systematically destroying my mind while my son eagerly listened. Preston was not a victim. He was a willing participant in my slow murder. He was perfectly willing to let me rot in a psychiatric facility just so he could pay off his own shadowy debts. My sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold and hardened resolve. Preston stood up abruptly, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. He grabbed a thick blue folder from the top of the filing cabinet, snatched his phone off the desk, and hurried out of the study. He pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. I listened closely as his rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway and faded toward the front door. The lock clicked. The house fell completely silent once again. I survived. The adrenaline from my narrow escape slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound and absolute clarity. I remained in the stifling darkness of the small bathroom for another full hour, listening intently to the silent house to ensure Preston had not returned. When I was absolutely certain the perimeter was clear, I slipped out of the study, locked the heavy brass deadbolt, and left the estate. I drove back to the hidden motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long and jagged shadows across the rusted cars and cracked pavement of the parking lot. I entered my room, locked the heavy deadbolt, and immediately sat down at the cheap veneer desk. I opened my laptop and reconnected to the hidden camera feed inside my study. The room on the screen was dark and perfectly still. The trap was holding. Now the agonizing wait commenced. I sat in that creaking chair as the hours ticked by, staring at the glowing monitor. I did not eat a single thing. I did not allow myself to sleep. I simply waited for the predators to make their move. By 9 o'clock that evening, the motel room was completely enveloped in shadows, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my computer screen. The silence of the forgotten motel was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing truck on the distant highway. I poured myself a small glass of bottled water, keeping my eyes locked on the live digital feed. At exactly 10:15, the silent red alert indicator flashed violently across the top left corner of my screen. Motion detected. The heavy brass lock on the study door clicked loudly. The door swung open, casting a long wedge of golden hallway light across the Persian rug. Victoria stepped into the room. She was entirely alone. She was wearing a silk dressing gown, moving with a silent and predatory grace. She closed the door softly behind her, ensuring the latch clicked shut, so she would not be disturbed by anyone. She did not turn on the main overhead lights. Instead, she clicked on the small brass reading lamp on my mahogany desk, casting a warm and concentrated pool of light over the workspace. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching her every movement, with the cold detachment of a scientist, observing a lethal virus under a microscope. Victoria walked around the heavy desk and immediately froze in her tracks. Through the grainy camera feed, I could clearly see her posture stiffen with sudden surprise. She had spotted the wall safe. She noticed the heavy steel door was cracked open by a mere 2 inches. A slow and deeply sinister smile spread across her face. It was the wicked grin of a starving predator that had just stumbled upon an unguarded feast. She genuinely believed that the neurosuppressants she fed me had finally eroded my mental faculties. She thought my mind was broken, to the point where I was leaving my most secure vault completely open and vulnerable. She approached the safe with hurried and desperate steps. She gripped the edge of the cold steel door and pulled it wide open. She peered directly into the dark interior, completely ignoring the neat stacks of irrelevant tax returns and outdated property deeds. Her eager eyes instantly locked onto the shiny black storage drive resting dead center in the vault. She reached out and snatched the drive with trembling fingers. She held it up to the light of the desk lamp, reading the bold white label I had carefully written that very morning. Global Assets and Crypto Ledgers, 2025. I watched her read the words, her lips silently mouthing the individual letters. The sheer look of euphoric triumph that washed over her face was absolutely nauseating to witness. She truly believed she had just secured the ultimate keys to my entire financial kingdom. She thought she now possessed the untraceable digital currency they desperately needed to pay off Preston's violent syndicate overlords. She slipped the black drive deep into the pocket of her silk dressing gown. Then she pushed the heavy steel safe door completely shut and gave the mechanical dial a rapid spin to lock it securely. She turned off the brass reading lamp and slipped out of the quiet study, disappearing back into the darkened hallway. She had taken the bait perfectly. Now I only needed her to swallow the hidden hook. I minimized the camera feed window on my laptop and opened a highly specialized command terminal Thomas had configured for me. The terminal presented a simple blank black screen with a blinking green cursor in the corner. I sat back in my rigid chair, staring intently at the cursor, waiting for the Trojan virus to initiate its automated sequence. The wait this time was painfully brief and entirely predictable. Victoria was an impatient and highly desperate woman who needed immediate answers to save her husband's life. She would never wait until morning to verify the contents of her newly stolen treasure. Less than 5 minutes after she exited my study, the black terminal screen on my laptop suddenly flashed a brilliant, blinding white. Lines of complex, encrypted code began scrolling rapidly down the monitor, moving much faster than the human eye could effectively process. The custom-built malware had successfully breached her primary operating system. She had gone straight to her upstairs guest bedroom, bypassed all her basic security protocols, and plugged the infected drive directly into her personal laptop. The moment the physical connection was made, the digital predator I had carefully planted awoke from its dormant slumber. It bypassed her consumer-grade firewalls in a mere fraction of a millisecond. It established a secure, completely untraceable backdoor connection directly to my heavily encrypted cloud server. The green cursor on my screen was instantly replaced by a rapidly updating progress bar. A notification chimed. Data extraction initiated. I watched in absolute unbroken silence as gigabytes of her private information began pouring directly into my remote server. The malware program was utterly ruthless and completely invisible to her standard security software. It was systematically cloning her entire computer hard drive while displaying a fake folder of corrupted files on her end to keep her distracted. It pulled her hidden email archives, her encrypted chat logs, and her deeply private browser histories. It bypassed the secure folders where she kept her hidden financial records, ripping the raw data from her machine and mirroring it perfectly onto mine. I could clearly see the specific file names flashing rapidly across my screen as they were successfully copied and instantly categorized. Medical proxies, illicit banking transfers, offshore routing numbers, and highly encrypted password vaults. Every single dark secret she possessed was being violently drained from her computer and delivered directly into my waiting hands. She thought she was downloading my entire life savings, but in brutal reality, she was handing me the digital keys to her own absolute destruction. I simply took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my cold water. The intricate digital trap had worked absolutely flawlessly. The adrenaline from my narrow escape slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound and absolute clarity. I remained in the stifling darkness of the small bathroom for another full hour, listening intently to the silent house to ensure Preston had not returned. When I was absolutely certain the perimeter was clear, I slipped out of the study, locked the heavy brass deadbolt, and left the estate. I drove back to the hidden motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long and jagged shadows across the rusted cars and cracked pavement of the parking lot. I entered my room, locked the heavy deadbolt, and immediately sat down at the cheap veneer desk. I opened my laptop and reconnected to the hidden camera feed inside my study. The room on the screen was dark and perfectly still. The trap was holding. Now the agonizing wait commenced. I sat in that creaking chair as the hours ticked by, staring at the glowing monitor. I did not eat a single thing. I did not allow myself to sleep. I simply waited for the predators to make their move. By 9 o'clock that evening, the motel room was completely enveloped in shadows, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my computer screen. The silence of the forgotten motel was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing truck on the distant highway. I poured myself a small glass of bottled water, keeping my eyes locked on the live digital feed. At exactly 10:15, the silent red alert indicator flashed violently across the top left corner of my screen. Motion detected. The heavy brass lock on the study door clicked loudly. The door swung open, casting a long wedge of golden hallway light across the Persian rug. Victoria stepped into the room. She was entirely alone. She was wearing a silk dressing gown, moving with a silent and predatory grace. She closed the door softly behind her, ensuring the latch clicked shut so she would not be disturbed by anyone. She did not turn on the main overhead lights. Instead, she clicked on the small brass reading lamp on my mahogany desk, casting a warm and concentrated pool of light over the workspace. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching her every movement, with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a lethal virus under a microscope. Victoria walked around the heavy desk and immediately froze in her tracks. Through the grainy camera feed, I could clearly see her posture stiffen with sudden surprise. She had spotted the wall safe. She noticed the heavy steel door was cracked open by a mere 2 inches. A slow and deeply sinister smile spread across her face. It was the wicked grin of a starving predator that had just stumbled upon an unguarded feast. She genuinely believed that the neurosuppressants she fed me had finally eroded my mental faculties. She thought my mind was broken to the point where I was leaving my most secure vault completely open and vulnerable. She approached the safe with hurried and desperate steps. She gripped the edge of the cold steel door and pulled it wide open. She peered directly into the dark interior, completely ignoring the neat stacks of irrelevant tax returns and outdated property deeds. Her eager eyes instantly locked onto the shiny black storage drive resting dead center in the vault. She reached out and snatched the drive with trembling fingers. She held it up to the light of the desk lamp, reading the bold white label I had carefully written that very morning. Global Assets and Crypto Ledgers 2025. I watched her read the words, her lips silently mouthing the individual letters. The sheer look of euphoric triumph that washed over her face was absolutely nauseating to witness. She truly believed she had just secured the ultimate keys to my entire financial kingdom. She thought she now possessed the untraceable digital currency they desperately needed to pay off Preston's violent syndicate overlords. She slipped the black drive deep into the pocket of her silk dressing gown. Then she pushed the heavy steel safe door completely shut and gave the mechanical dial a rapid spin to lock it securely. She turned off the brass reading lamp and slipped out of the quiet study, disappearing back into the darkened hallway. She had taken the bait perfectly. Now I only needed her to swallow the hidden hook. I minimized the camera feed window on my laptop and opened a highly specialized command terminal Thomas had configured for me. The terminal presented a simple blank black screen with a blinking green cursor in the corner. I sat back in my rigid chair, staring intently at the cursor, waiting for the Trojan virus to initiate its automated sequence. The wait this time was painfully brief and entirely predictable. Victoria was an impatient and highly desperate woman who needed immediate answers to save her husband's life. She would never wait until morning to verify the contents of her newly stolen treasure. Less than 5 minutes after she exited my study, the black terminal screen on my laptop suddenly flashed a brilliant, blinding white. Lines of complex encrypted code began scrolling rapidly down the monitor, moving much faster than the human eye could effectively process. The custom-built malware had successfully breached her primary operating system. She had gone straight to her upstairs guest bedroom, bypassed all her basic security protocols, and plugged the infected drive directly into her personal laptop. The moment the physical connection was made, the digital predator I had carefully planted awoke from its dormant slumber. It bypassed her consumer-grade firewalls in a mere fraction of a millisecond. It established a secure, completely untraceable backdoor connection directly to my heavily encrypted cloud server. The green cursor on my screen was instantly replaced by a rapidly updating progress bar. A notification chimed. Data extraction initiated. I watched in absolute, unbroken silence as gigabytes of her private information began pouring directly into my remote server. The malware program was utterly ruthless and completely invisible to her standard security software. It was systematically cloning her entire computer hard drive while displaying a fake folder of corrupted files on her end to keep her distracted. It pulled her hidden email archives, her encrypted chat logs, and her deeply private browser histories. It bypassed the secure folders where she kept her hidden financial records, ripping the raw data from her machine and mirroring it perfectly onto mine. I could clearly see the specific file names flashing rapidly across my screen as they were successfully copied and instantly categorized. Medical proxies, illicit banking transfers, offshore routing numbers, and highly encrypted password vaults. Every single dark secret she possessed was being violently drained from her computer and delivered directly into my waiting hands. She thought she was downloading my entire life savings, but in brutal reality she was handing me the digital keys to her own absolute destruction. I simply took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my cold water. The intricate digital trap had worked absolutely flawlessly. The progress bar on my laptop screen reached 100%. A quiet, unobtrusive chime echoed in the dimly lit motel room. The data extraction was entirely complete. I safely disconnected my secure server, wiped the motel IP address from my routing history, and closed the laptop. The digital trap had not merely caught the rats, it had swallowed them whole. I packed my belongings into my travel bag, left the cash for the room on the cheap veneer desk, and walked out into the cool night air. I drove straight to the heavily fortified downtown offices of my corporate attorney. Thomas was waiting for me in his primary conference room. The space was a fortress of glass and steel, completely soundproofed and swept daily for electronic listening devices. Thomas sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a crisp navy suit, his posture impeccably straight, his expression an unreadable mask of absolute legal ruthlessness. He had already assembled 2 of his top forensic accountants. They were silent, highly paid professionals who specialized in dissecting complex financial crimes. I handed my encrypted laptop to the lead accountant. He connected it to their isolated internal network, and the autopsy of my family formally began. We projected the cloned contents of the stolen hard drive onto the massive screen at the far end of the room. The sheer volume of data she had hoarded was staggering. She had meticulously organized her stolen files into neatly labeled, color-coded directories. It was the digital footprint of a deeply arrogant woman who genuinely believed she would never, ever be caught. She thought she was untouchable. Thomas and I sat side by side, drinking black coffee in the sterile silence of the room, watching the accountants sift through the wreckage of my personal life. It took them less than 3 hours to find the primary anomaly. Hidden deep within a nested folder disguised as mundane household renovation receipts was a highly encrypted spreadsheet file. Victoria had taken great care to lock the document behind a sophisticated security wall. Unfortunately for her, she had also saved a plain-text document containing her master passwords right on her desktop. Her sheer arrogance had completely overridden her basic common sense. The lead accountant bypassed the encryption in a matter of seconds. The spreadsheet flashed onto the large screen, expanding into hundreds of meticulous rows and columns. I stood up from my chair and walked closer to the projection, my eyes scanning the intricate data. It was a master ledger, but it was not tracking my offshore assets or my legitimate real estate holdings. It was a private dual-entry accounting of every single dollar Preston and Victoria had siphoned directly out of my company over the past 36 months. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. I had spent 40 years identifying corporate fraud, and now I was staring at a textbook embezzlement scheme engineered by my own flesh and blood. The mechanics of their deception were brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Preston had weaponized his title as the Vice President of Acquisitions. I had given him that position because I trusted him. I had handed him the keys to the kingdom, assuming he would protect the walls. Instead, he used his unrestricted executive clearance to bypass our standard vendor verification protocols. The ledger detailed a vast network of ghost contractors. These were entirely fabricated companies, with legitimate-looking invoices, billing my firm for environmental impact studies, structural surveys, and architectural consultations that never actually happened. Preston would approve the fraudulent invoices directly from his desk. The accounting department, seeing the authorizing signature of the boss, paid the bills without asking a single question. My name and my absolute authority had served as their impenetrable shield. The money flowed out of my corporate accounts and vanished into a complex web of anonymous shell companies registered in states with incredibly lax corporate transparency laws. From there, the funds were quietly funneled directly into joint accounts, completely controlled by Victoria and Preston. Thomas stood up and walked over to the screen, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the total column. He turned to look at me, his expression devoid of any sympathetic emotion. Over the last 3 years, he stated, his voice clinical and perfectly steady. Your son and his wife have successfully stolen $2,400,000 from your primary operating accounts. $2.4 million. The number hung heavily in the chilled, sterile air of the conference room. It was not a rounding error. It was not a temporary lapse in financial judgment. It was a massive, sustained, and highly coordinated theft. They had been bleeding my company dry, smiling at me across the dinner table every single night while actively robbing me blind. Preston had kissed my cheek. Victoria had brewed my tea. And all the while they were systematically draining my life work into their own pockets. But as I stared at the staggering total on the screen, my analytical mind instantly pivoted away from the shock of the betrayal. A new glaring discrepancy emerged from the numbers. $2.4 million is an astronomical amount of stolen liquid cash. If a person suddenly acquires that level of untraceable wealth, there are always visible indicators. You see newly purchased luxury vehicles, massive real estate acquisitions, exotic vacations, or incredibly expensive jewelry. Wealth of that magnitude always leaves a highly visible physical footprint. Yet Preston and Victoria had nothing of the sort to show for it. They drove the standard company leased vehicles I had approved for them. They were currently living in my guest suite, while their modest suburban home underwent supposedly routine plumbing renovations. They had not taken a lavish vacation in over 4 years. They dressed well, but within the completely normal parameters of a standard corporate executive salary. There were no hidden mansions. There were no private yachts. There was absolutely zero physical evidence of the stolen millions. I turned to Thomas, the cold realization settling over me like a heavy winter frost. "The money is completely gone," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh and quiet register. "They stole over $2 million from me, and they do not have a single tangible asset to show for it. It has vanished." Thomas nodded slowly, tapping his expensive pen against the edge of the mahogany table. "Embezzlers always buy things, Richard. They steal because they want to live a lifestyle they cannot afford. If they are not buying assets, they are paying something off." He looked back at the sprawling digital ledger on the screen. "The question is not how they stole the money. We already know that. The terrifying question is what exactly did they spend $2.4 million on?" I walked back to my chair and sat down, staring at the empty coffee cup in my hands. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting again, aligning to form a picture far darker than simple corporate theft. I looked up at the glowing screen again and ordered the quiet forensic accountants to keep digging much deeper. The sterile silence of the conference room pressed against my eardrums as the two forensic accountants went back to work. I had ordered them to keep digging much deeper, and they followed that command with the relentless precision of machines. Thomas stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sleeping city, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He knew just as I did that $2,400,000 does not simply evaporate into thin air without leaving a catastrophic vacuum. If Preston was not buying yachts or mansions, he was paying for his very survival. And if he was paying for his survival, he was bound to people who did not negotiate with legal contracts. But the financial ledger, as devastating as it was merely the first layer of this putrid onion. The true horror of their betrayal was not hidden in the offshore bank routing numbers. It was buried in private communications. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the younger accountant raised his hand. He did not speak, but the sudden cessation of his rapid typing signaled a major discovery. He had bypassed a secondary security partition on the cloned hard drive. Hidden beneath layers of decoy folders was a standalone, heavily encrypted email client. She had used a virtual private network and a sophisticated scrubbing protocol to hide her digital tracks, but the Trojan virus had captured the decryption keys directly from her active memory cache when she plugged the drive into her laptop. The accountant mirrored the email inbox onto the massive projection screen. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the subject lines. They were completely devoid of any financial terminology. Instead, they read like sterile medical inquiries, cognitive baseline parameters, toxicity accumulation rates, facility admission requirements. I instructed the accountant to open the most recent email chain. The recipient was a man named Arthur Vance. Thomas immediately pulled out his mobile device and ran the name through his extensive legal database. Within 60 seconds, he had a complete profile. Arthur Vance was not a prominent specialist or a respected neurologist. He was a disgraced former physician whose medical license had been permanently revoked by the state medical board 5 years ago for aggressively overprescribing heavy sedatives and falsifying patient charts for profit. He was a ghost doctor who operated entirely in the shadows, trading medical perjury for untraceable cash. The lead accountant clicked on a document enclosed in an email dated just 3 days ago. The file expanded across the glowing screen, bearing the forged letterhead of a highly prestigious neurological clinic in the city. It was a comprehensive, legally binding medical evaluation. It bore my full legal name, my date of birth, and a detailed, thoroughly fabricated medical history. I read the diagnostic summary in a state of absolute icy detachment. According to this paperwork, I was currently suffering from severe rapid-onset Alzheimer's disease. The forged evaluation claimed I was experiencing catastrophic memory failures, frequent bouts of aggressive paranoia, and a complete inability to manage my own basic daily functions. The fraudulent physician had explicitly concluded that I was a direct danger to myself and completely unfit to handle any financial, legal, or personal affairs. At the very bottom of the forged medical document, was a bold, legally notarized recommendation demanding that my power of attorney be immediately transferred to my next of kin, which the page specifically identified as my son Preston. But a forged medical evaluation is utterly useless if the patient can walk into a courtroom, speak coherently to a judge, and prove their mind is perfectly sound. Victoria knew this. She knew she could not just wave a fake piece of paper and steal my empire. She needed my physical condition to flawlessly match the fabricated diagnosis. She needed to break my mind. I instructed the accountant to open the earlier emails in the thread. The correspondence detailed a highly specific customized chemical regimen. The disgraced doctor had procured a potent cocktail of heavily restricted neurosuppressants and powerful antipsychotic tranquilizers. Victoria had paid him over $50,000 from the embezzled funds to acquire the drugs on the black market. The emails contained precise dosage instructions calculating exactly how many milligrams were required to bypass my liver function and build up a toxic reservoir in my bloodstream over a period of 90 days. They discussed the precise masking agents needed to hide the bitter chemical taste of the medication. The answer, elegantly and ruthlessly outlined in a message from Victoria herself, was raw honey and steeped chamomile. The realization hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The nightly routine, the gentle smile, the warm ceramic mug handed to me every single evening while I sat in my leather armchair. Victoria had not just been stealing my money. She had been physically, systematically, and deliberately poisoning me in my own home. Every time I thanked her for the tea, I had been swallowing a calculated dose of brain-destroying chemicals designed to strip away my memories, induce artificial paranoia, and mirror the exact symptoms of a degenerative neurological disease. I was fighting for my literal life. The final email in the chain outlined their exact timeline. It was a masterclass in premeditated, cold-blooded murder of the mind. The schedule was set to execute with absolute ruthlessness during the upcoming week. On Tuesday morning, Victoria was scheduled to bring the disgraced doctor into my home under the guise of a routine wellness check. Saturated with the neurosuppressants she planned to heavily increase over the weekend, I would easily and catastrophically fail the administered cognitive tests. On Wednesday, armed with the failed test and the forged medical evaluation, Preston would petition the emergency courts to seize my absolute power of attorney, declaring me legally incompetent. On Thursday, with the ink on the court order barely dry, Preston would use his newfound legal authority to sign the deeds of my most valuable commercial properties directly over to his violent syndicate creditors, saving his own life with my assets. And on Friday, the final phase of their terrifying protocol would commence. The accountant opened one last document attached to the thread. It was a signed admission contract for a state-run, severely underfunded psychiatric care facility located 300 miles away in a desolate rural county. It was a place known for horrific neglect, a warehouse for the forgotten elderly. Victoria had explicitly paid a premium to secure a locked, isolated ward where visitors were strictly restricted. They were not simply going to steal my fortune and leave me in peace. They were going to institutionalize me. They intended to lock me inside a sterile room strapped to a medical bed doped on heavy sedatives and leave me to rot in utter darkness until my body eventually gave out. I stood in the silent conference room staring at the blueprint of my own execution. The plausible lies were dead. The truth was absolute. I was looking at the faces of true monsters. They had completely stripped away any lingering trace of familial loyalty. Now it was my turn to strike back very hard. The digital projection screen cast a cold light across the mahogany conference table. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of what my own family had orchestrated. Thomas broke the silence. He closed his laptop with a sharp snap and stood up. His voice was no longer that of a detached attorney. It carried the urgent hard edge of a man staring at a ticking bomb. "Richard," he said firmly, leaning over the table to look at me. "We are out of time. We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now without wasting another minute. This is clearly no longer a simple civil matter or a standard corporate embezzlement case that we can manage quietly. This is a conspiracy to commit murder and defraud an entire estate. We currently possess all the forged medical evaluations, the receipts for the black market neurosuppressants, and the digital footprint of their massive criminal operation. We hand this drive to the federal authorities tonight, and your son and his wife will be in handcuffs before the sunrise tomorrow morning. It was the rational advice of a brilliant legal mind. But Thomas was looking at this volatile situation as a mathematical equation. I was looking at it as a father who understood the brutal mechanics of the criminal underworld. I shook my head slowly, my voice carrying an absolute authority. "No," I replied, my gaze hardening. "We are not calling the federal authorities. Not yet." Thomas stared at me in profound disbelief. "Richard, they are poisoning you," he argued, his composure slipping. "They are trying to erase your mind and lock you in a psychiatric ward. You cannot handle a threat of this magnitude internally." I stood up and walked toward the window looking out over the city skyline. "I know exactly what they are doing to me, Thomas. I know they want me gone. But you are missing the most critical variable in this entire equation." I turned back to face the room. "If we send the FBI to my house tonight, the government will immediately freeze all of Preston's accounts. The moment those accounts are frozen, the violent syndicate he owes $5 million to will know he is broke. They will realize he cannot deliver the deed to my commercial plaza by Monday morning as he promised. They will not wait for the justice system to process his fraud charges. They will simply kill him. They will murder my son to make a public example out of him to deter other debtors." I let out a heavy breath, feeling the weight of my paternal instincts battling my desire for retribution. Preston had betrayed me in the most horrific way imaginable. He had watched Victoria pour poison into my evening tea, eagerly counting down the days until my mind snapped. He was a coward and a traitor to his own blood. But despite his catastrophic failures, he was still the boy I had raised. I could not simply stand by and allow a shadow syndicate to execute him in the streets. I refused to let gangsters tear my family apart, even a family as fractured as mine had become. I straightened my posture, letting the cold, calculating auditor within me take control of the narrative. "I am not going to let them murder my son," I stated evenly. "But I am not going to let him win either. I am going to dismantle this threat myself on my own terms." Thomas crossed his arms, his legal mind shifting gears to accommodate my dangerous parameters. "How exactly do you plan to do that, Richard?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "If Preston executes that forged medical power of attorney on Wednesday, he will have legal authority to sign your properties away to those criminals." I walked back to the massive mahogany conference table and placed both of my hands firmly on the polished wood, projecting an aura of absolute resolve. "He can only sign away what I legally own, Thomas. So we are going to ensure that by the time the sun rises on Monday morning, I do not legally own a single thing to my name." I instructed my attorney to instantly begin drafting the highly complex paperwork required to establish an irrevocable blind trust. It is the absolute ultimate financial fortress, an impenetrable legal shield that cannot be pierced by any conventional weapon. By transferring every single commercial property, every liquid bank account, and every corporate holding I possessed directly into this specific type of trust, I would willingly and completely strip myself of all direct legal ownership. The blind trust would immediately become an independent entity managed strictly by an anonymous, heavily vetted third-party trustee who answers to no one but the foundational charter. Because the trust is entirely irrevocable, I cannot simply dissolve it, alter its beneficiaries, or change its fundamental terms once it is fully executed and filed with the state. Most importantly, no medical proxy, no forged power of attorney, and no court order can ever breach its walls. Even if Preston declared me incompetent and seized control of my personal affairs, he would find himself holding the keys to an empty vault. He cannot transfer a commercial property deed to a syndicate if my name is no longer listed on that deed. It was the perfect masterstroke. I was isolating my life's work from the blast radius of his financial failures. Thomas's eyes widened slightly as he grasped the brilliance of the maneuver. It will take my legal team working through the weekend to draft and file the transfer documents, he warned. We will have to wake up federal judges to expedite the process. Do whatever it takes, I commanded, my voice absolute. I want every asset locked inside that blind trust by Sunday night. The defensive perimeter was set. When Preston and Victoria eagerly attempt to finalize their wicked and profoundly murderous scheme later this week, they are going to discover a terrifying, inescapable reality. They will quickly find out that they have spent 3 entire months trying to systematically poison a ghost. I gathered my heavy wool coat from the back of the leather chair and turned toward the heavy glass exit, leaving Thomas alone to rapidly rally his elite legal strike team. My commercial properties were entirely safe. My lifetime legacy was completely secure. My son would live to face his own horrific actions without the immediate paralyzing threat of a violent syndicate execution permanently hanging over his head. I walked out of the towering corporate building and stepped directly into the cool, refreshing night air. I looked up at the darkened sky, feeling the cold wind hit my face. The complex digital traps had all been flawlessly sprung, and the final legal barricades were being rapidly constructed. All the hidden toxic truths had finally cascaded into the bright open light. The preparation phase was now entirely complete. There was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable dawn and deliberately prepare my weary, aging soul for the final, deeply catastrophic confrontation that would permanently end this devastating familial war once and for all. I returned to the cold isolation of my hidden motel room and prepared my mind for the final, devastating sequence. I opened my encrypted laptop and brought the master terminal online. The blind trust was fully executed. It was the very last phase of my long calculated war against my own blood. Now I merely had to wait for the poison to finish its course within their own ranks. The digital clock on the bottom right corner of my screen ticked methodically toward the deepest hour of the night. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning when the heavy silence of the room was finally broken. My mobile phone began to vibrate violently against the nightstand. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the desperation I knew was waiting on the other end of the line. I picked up the device and pressed the green button holding the speaker to my ear without saying a word. Dad Preston stammered frantically, his voice breaking with an unnatural pitch of sheer, unmistakable terror. The composed, arrogant executive I knew had been hollowed out, replaced by a terrified child. "Victoria went into your study," he gasped, his breathing uneven. "She took something. She plugged a black storage drive into her personal computer, and now the whole network is locked out. Nothing is working, Dad. The digital system is freezing up." I did not yell. I did not ask for an explanation. I simply took a slow, methodical sip of my aged, neat Kentucky bourbon, closed my eyes, and replied in a dead, perfectly calm voice. And the screen went black. And it is flashing a red countdown timer right now, is it not? The dead silence on the other end of the line was the sweetest sound I had heard in 12 years. I did not need Preston to confirm my statement. I could see everything unfolding in real time across my monitor. The custom-built Trojan virus, having successfully completed its primary objective of cloning Victoria's dark secrets, had been lying dormant inside her machine waiting for a specific trigger. Victoria, operating blindly under the crushing, relentless pressure of the violent syndicate deadline, genuinely believed that the black drive contained my hidden offshore cryptocurrency ledgers. She thought she possessed the digital keys to untraceable millions. Desperate to buy her husband more time, she had booted up her laptop in the middle of the night, connected to their secure home network, and attempted to initiate a blind transfer to the routing numbers the syndicate had provided. She wanted to send a ghost payment designed to appease the wolves at their door. I watched the bright green command lines cascading down my terminal screen. Victoria had navigated to her secure financial client. She had attached the dummy files from the black drive. She had typed in the syndicate destination address. And then, completely unaware of the lethal digital trap she was firmly standing inside, she hit the send button. The moment her finger depressed that key, she did not authorize a financial transfer. She executed the secondary payload of the Trojan virus. On my screen, the data flow shifted from passive monitoring to aggressive, catastrophic disruption. The malware expanded outward with exponential speed. It surged out of her personal laptop and infected their entire local network within a fraction of a second. First, the virus targeted the host machine. It systematically overwrote the core registry files of Victoria's laptop, annihilating the operating system. I could picture the moment her screen froze, the false hope draining from her eyes as the display glitched, shuddered, and abruptly snapped to a solid black. A bold, steadily pulsing red digital timer materialized directly in the center of her ruined monitor, slowly counting down from 60 seconds to absolute zero. It was a theatrical display designed strictly to induce sheer panic. Her laptop was irreversibly bricked. It was reduced to a piece of plastic and metal, trapping all of her desperate commands inside a dead machine. But the virus was far from finished. The Trojan leaped from her dead computer into the centralized hub of their smart home system. Preston and Victoria had spent a small fortune outfitting their residence with the latest technology. They controlled their environment from their smartphones, boasting about their security grids and electronic deadbolts. That arrogance was now their cage. I watched a series of confirmation codes flash across my remote terminal. The malware overrode the administrative privileges of their home hub. The electronic deadbolts on every single exterior door of their sprawling house engaged simultaneously with a very loud metallic slam. The reinforced window shutters designed to protect the property from severe storms descended and locked firmly into place, sealing them inside. Then the virus seized control of the audio and security systems. The entire interior lighting grid abruptly cut out, plunging their massive house into absolute blinding darkness for 3 agonizing seconds. Suddenly, every single light in the residence began flashing in a strobing pattern. The speakers wired into every room, ceiling, and hallway roared to life. The system bypassed all volume limiters, blasting the primary security breach siren at a deafening decibel level. The piercing shrieks echoed through the walls, transforming their home into a chaotic, inescapable nightmare. I could hear the faint, muffled wailing of the sirens bleeding through the receiver of my mobile phone, drowning out Preston's terrified sobbing. While the physical environment of their home descended into chaos, the true lethal strike was executed silently in the digital background. The Trojan virus accessed Victoria's default email client one final time before the network collapsed. It automatically generated a new encrypted message addressed directly to the email of the violent syndicate. The silent virus did not send my fabricated cryptocurrency ledgers. Instead, it attached a heavily redacted, perfectly curated version of Preston's own embezzlement files. It sent the data that proved Preston had already squandered the $2.4 million he had stolen from my company. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he possessed absolutely zero liquid assets, no hidden cash reserves, and no viable means of paying off his massive, dangerous debt. The virus effectively informed the most dangerous criminals in the city that the man who owed them $5 million was completely, undeniably broke. It proved that Preston was a desperate fraud who had been continually lying to them about his access to my commercial real estate properties. The highly automated email successfully bypassed the outgoing server and instantly confirmed full delivery directly to the dangerous syndicate boss. I sat back in my creaking motel chair, letting out a long, slow breath as the final confirmation code locked into place on my glowing screen. The transaction was complete. The ultimate leverage had been deployed. Preston and Victoria were now locked inside a blinding, deafening fortress of their own making, fully realizing that their grand murderous scheme had just collapsed in the most spectacular and terrifying fashion imaginable. The wolves were no longer waiting patiently at the door. The wolves had just been explicitly told that the sheep had absolutely nothing left to offer them. I left the motel room and drove through the deserted city streets, the tires of my car humming a steady rhythm against the cold pavement. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:30 in the morning. I approached my own estate not as a grieving widower returning to rest, but as a warden arriving to inspect his prisoners. The exterior of the sprawling house was a spectacle of absolute digital chaos. The heavy security shutters were locked firmly over the windows. The exterior floodlights were flashing in a frantic, blinding sequence. Even from the end of the long driveway, I could hear the muffled, high-pitched wailing of the interior security sirens bleeding through the reinforced walls. I parked my car near the wide front steps, stepped out into the chilly night air, and walked calmly toward the heavy front door. The smart lock glowed with a harsh red warning light, indicating a total system lockdown. Victoria and Preston were entirely trapped inside a digital cage of their own making. I pulled out my mobile phone, opened the administrative application, and bypassed the corrupted network using my encrypted master access code. The deadbolt retracted with a heavy, satisfying metallic thud. I pushed the door open and stepped into the deafening, strobing madness of the grand foyer. The noise inside the house was physically punishing. The alarm system shrieked from every speaker, vibrating deep inside my chest. The smart bulbs in the hallway flickered rapidly between harsh white and pitch black. I walked slowly toward the main control panel on the wall, tapped in a secondary override sequence, and abruptly killed the entire security system. The deafening sirens cut out instantly. The strobing lights snapped back to a steady, warm amber glow. The sudden, suffocating silence that followed was far more terrifying than the noise. From the direction of the kitchen, I heard the frantic, ragged sound of heavy breathing and frantic sobbing. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I rounded the corner and found them. My son and his wife were huddled near the center of the massive marble kitchen island. They looked absolutely wretched. Victoria was wearing a silk dressing gown, her hair completely disheveled, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears. Preston was clutching a useless bricked tablet in his trembling hands, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. They stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, completely paralyzed by my sudden appearance. They had expected the violent syndicate to break down the door. They had never expected me. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The illusion of our perfect, loving family shattered completely, the broken pieces settling onto the pristine kitchen floor. Victoria was the very first to break. The sheer, calculating arrogance she had displayed while pouring my tea just a few hours ago completely vanished. She lunged forward, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate scream. "Richard," she cried out, pointing a trembling finger directly at my son. "You have to believe me. Preston forced me into this. He made me do it. He owes so much money to terrible, violent people. And he said they were going to kill us both if I did not help him access the safe. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear to you, I never wanted to take your money." She fell to her knees, sobbing violently, utilizing the exact same manufactured tears she had used to explain away the clay dust on my keys. But Preston did not stand by and let her shift the blame. The cowardly executive finally snapped. He dropped the useless tablet and shouted right back at her. "Do not lie to him," Preston bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You are the one who hired the disgraced doctor. You are the one who bought the chemicals on the dark web. Dad, you have to listen to me. I had a gambling problem, yes, but her lavish lifestyle pushed me over the edge. She demanded things I could not afford. She came up with the plan to alter your mind. She wanted to lock you away in that facility. I only wanted the commercial plaza to pay off my debts. I never wanted to poison you. I swear to God I never did." They stood in my kitchen, screaming at each other, tearing each other apart like starving animals fighting over a scrap of meat. They were eagerly trading confessions of embezzlement, extortion, and attempted murder just to save their own skin. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply walked forward, closing the distance until I stood directly over the marble kitchen island. I unzipped the front pocket of my heavy coat and pulled out a thick, legal manila folder. I raised my hand and slammed the folder down onto the hard marble surface. The sharp, violent smack echoed through the large room, instantly silencing their pathetic, screaming argument. They both flinched, their eyes dropping down to the documents spilling out across the stone counter. I reached out and spread the papers wide for them to see clearly. There, resting under the bright kitchen lights, was the comprehensive medical proxy Victoria had paid $50,000 to forge. Right next to it was the detailed toxicology report I had commissioned from a private expedited laboratory just a few hours ago, utilizing the residual chamomile tea from the ceramic mug Victoria had handed me. The lab report clearly identified the heavy, highly restricted neurosuppressants explicitly designed to mimic rapid-onset dementia. I placed my hands flat on the marble counter, leaning forward so that I was looking directly into their horrified, unblinking eyes. "The plausible lies are officially dead," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut through the silence like a razor blade. "There will be no more stories about dropped keys. There will be no more sudden interests in family photo albums. I know about the $2.4 million you stole from my company accounts. I know about the violent syndicate you currently owe $5 million to because of your pathetic sports betting. And most importantly, I know exactly what you have been pouring into my cup every single night to slowly erase my mind and steal my entire life. You thought I was just a blind, grieving old man who would quietly fade away into the shadows. You thought you could simply orchestrate my demise from inside my own home without facing a single consequence. But you forgot one crucial detail about who I really am. I built an absolute empire by finding the hidden truths that desperate criminals tried to bury. I saw your trap before you even finished setting it, and now you are standing directly inside mine. Your grand scheme has completely collapsed under the weight of its own spectacular arrogance. You have absolutely nowhere left to hide, and there is no one left to manipulate anymore. The long game is entirely over, and you have both definitively lost everything you ever sought to steal from me tonight in this exact room." The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. Victoria and Preston remained frozen, their breathing ragged, their eyes locked on the documents spread across the marble island. The reality of their catastrophic failure was sinking into their bones. They had spent months treating me like a fading ghost, unaware I had been building a titanium cage around them. I watched my son's jaw tremble as he stared at the toxicology report. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never materialized. He closed his mouth and simply stared at the floor, a broken, empty vessel. Instead, a sharp, violent sound shattered the quiet tension of the kitchen. Preston's mobile phone, resting face up on the edge of the counter, began to vibrate frantically against the stone surface. The harsh digital ringtone pierced the air like a siren. Preston flinched violently, his body jerking backward as if the device had suddenly caught fire. He stared at the glowing screen, his face draining of whatever color it had left. I did not need to look at the caller identification to know who was attempting to reach him. The custom Trojan virus had automatically emailed the redacted embezzlement ledger to his violent creditors mere minutes ago. The hungry wolves had received proof that their debtor was completely broke, and they were calling to demand a bloody explanation. Preston remained paralyzed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep them at his sides. "Answer the phone right now," I commanded, my voice flat and devoid of sympathy. He shook his head rapidly, stumbling backward until his spine hit the stainless refrigerator. "I cannot do it," he whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. "They already know everything. They saw the financial files you just sent them. They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to send someone here right now and kill us both." Victoria let out a muffled sob, covering her face with her hands and sinking lower toward the floor. They were entirely broken, reduced to terrified children, hiding from the monsters they had willingly invited into their lives. I stepped forward, moving with the calm pace of a man who was fully and completely in control of the battlefield. I reached down and picked up the vibrating device from the polished marble counter. I swiped my index finger across the glass screen, accepted the incoming call, and pressed the speakerphone button so the audio would project clearly into the kitchen. I set the phone back down onto the counter and waited in perfect absolute silence. For 2 long seconds, there was only the faint sound of static on the open line. Then a low, gravelly voice echoed loudly through the room. It was not the voice of a hot-headed, uneducated street thug. It was the calm, measured tone of a high-level syndicate operator who was intimately accustomed to wielding absolute power over desperate people. The voice did not ask for a name. It simply delivered a brutal demand. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain the email I just received, Preston," the voice stated, carrying a cold and lethal promise. "Because if you truly do not have my money, I am sending a professional team to your specific location right now, and we are going to start taking our payment in very small pieces." Preston let out a whimpering gasp, sliding completely down to the kitchen floor. I leaned over the marble island, positioning myself directly above the speaker of the phone. I did not raise my voice in the slightest. I did not project any visible fear or anger. I spoke with the exact same chilled precision I always used when dismantling fraudulent corporate executives inside a hostile boardroom. "Preston is not currently available to take your call this evening," I stated evenly, ensuring every single syllable was perfectly enunciated. "My name is Richard. I am the man who owns the commercial real estate plaza you were expecting to receive by Monday morning. I am also the man who personally orchestrated the email you just received proving permanently that my son has 0 liquid assets." There was a sharp, calculating pause on the other end of it. The syndicate boss was clearly not used to being addressed with such blatant authority by a total stranger. "Who the hell do you think you are talking to, old man?" the voice growled, the calm facade slipping slightly to reveal a terrifying flash of raw violence. "I will send my best people to your house right now and burn the entire estate to the ground with both of you screaming inside it." I smiled a cold smile that no one else could see. "You are not going to send anyone to this location," I replied smoothly. "You are going to listen to the mathematical reality of your current situation. As of midnight tonight, every commercial property and liquid asset I own has been legally transferred into an irrevocable blind trust managed by an anonymous third party. I do not legally own the downtown plaza anymore, which means Preston cannot sign the deed over to you, no matter how many bones you decide to break." I let that financial reality sink in for a moment before delivering the final blow. Furthermore, I continued, my voice hardening into a weapon. "My legal team is currently finalizing a comprehensive report detailing the $2.4 million Preston stole from my corporate accounts. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will be arriving very shortly to take him into federal custody. He is going to be indicted on massive wire fraud charges before the sun comes up." I stared down at the glowing screen of the phone delivering my final absolute verdict. "He is property of the United States government now. You cannot collect a $5 million debt from a man who is locked inside a concrete box. And if you ever attempt to come near my blind trust, I will personally hand the digital routing numbers of your offshore accounts directly to the feds, and I will bury your entire operation under a massive mountain of federal indictments." The silence that followed my threat was profound and heavily weighted. The syndicate boss was a violent man, but he was also a pragmatic businessman. He recognized a losing hand the very second he saw one. He understood that the leverage had completely shifted away from his favor. He could not extract payment from a high-profile federal prisoner. He certainly could not risk exposing his lucrative shadow empire just to punish a failed gambler. I had neutralized his entire threat with a simple transfer of legal liability. "Keep your pathetic son," the boss finally muttered, his voice dripping with pure disgust. The line clicked sharply. The call disconnected immediately. The low drone of the dial tone filled the quiet kitchen. I reached down and ended the call, sliding the mobile phone across the cold marble counter. The external threat was completely eliminated. The predators outside the gates had retreated into the darkness. Now, I only had to finish dealing with the traitors who were already locked inside my home. The heavy silence in the grand kitchen stretched into a suffocating eternity. I stood tall over the marble island, watching the two people I had once considered my closest family reduce themselves to trembling shells. Preston was shaking violently, his chest heaving as he stared at the dark screen of his mobile phone. He knew the violent syndicate was no longer coming to execute him, but he also knew the price of his survival was his absolute freedom. Victoria remained on her knees, her manicured hands gripping the hem of her silk pajama trousers. She was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, her mind desperately racing to find a new lie, a new manipulation, or a new escape route. But there was nowhere left to run. The digital fortress had sealed them inside, and the damning evidence rested plainly under the bright kitchen lights. Then, piercing through the quiet tension of the sprawling estate, a faint and distinct sound emerged from the distance. It started as a low wail echoing across the sleeping suburban landscape. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified, growing steadily louder as it rapidly approached the heavy iron gates of the property. Sirens. It was the sharp, unmistakable shriek of multiple police cruisers and federal black utility vehicles tearing through the dark city streets converging on our location. Preston slowly raised his head, his eyes widening in a state of renewed cataclysmic terror. He looked toward the heavy reinforced windows, watching the flashing red and blue lights begin to paint the walls of the grand foyer in aggressive strobing colors. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "You called them," he whispered, his voice devoid of life. "You actually called the federal authorities on your own son." I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked down at him with an expression of absolute unyielding ice. "I did not call them tonight, Preston," I replied smoothly. "My legal team contacted them yesterday morning. I merely provided the final digital evidence when Victoria triggered the extraction virus an hour ago. They have been waiting all night." The flashing lights illuminated the kitchen with a harsh, unforgiving glare. The heavy tires of several armored vehicles screeched to a halt on the paved driveway outside. Car doors slammed. Heavy tactical footsteps pounded against the stone walkway leading up to the front entrance. I pulled my mobile phone from my coat pocket and tapped the administrative bypass application one final time, unlocking the massive front door to allow the strike team to enter. The door swung open with a heavy thud. Thomas stepped into the grand foyer first. He was flanked by a highly coordinated team of federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers and local police officers carrying tactical equipment. Thomas looked exactly as he had in the conference room earlier that night, completely composed, meticulously dressed, and operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He carried a thick leather briefcase containing the physical warrants. He surveyed the chaotic, strobing hallway before leading the entire squad of law enforcement officers directly toward the kitchen. Victoria scrambled backward across the polished hardwood floor, her silk pajamas tearing slightly against a cabinet edge as the armed agents swarmed into the room. She pressed her back against the stainless steel oven, holding her hands up in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Please," she screamed, her voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. "Please, do not do this. I did not do anything wrong. He forced me to do it. He controlled the bank accounts. I am just his wife." She pointed a shaking finger at Preston, abandoning the man she had conspired with for 3 years. "You cannot arrest me. I am a victim here. Richard, please tell them I am a victim. Please show some mercy." The lead federal agent did not hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbed Victoria by the arm, and pulled her roughly to her feet. He spun her around, pressing her firmly against the marble counter right next to the forged medical proxy she had paid $50,000 to procure. The metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed over her desperate, hyperventilating sobs. Victoria fought against the restraints, twisting her wrists and screaming my name, begging for a leniency she absolutely did not deserve. Her pristine image was annihilated. She was a captured predator, stripped of her venom, reduced to nothing more than a pathetic, weeping criminal in her ruined silk pajamas. Preston did not fight the federal agents when they approached him. He did not attempt to run, and he did not try to blame his wife. The overwhelming reality of his spectacular failure had broken his spirit. As the heavy steel cuffs snapped tightly shut around his wrists, his legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, pulling the two holding agents down slightly with his dead weight. He looked up at me from the cold floor, his face completely drenched in sweat and tears. "Dad, please." Preston begged, his voice a guttural sob that tore through his chest. "You cannot let them take me to a federal prison. I will not survive in there. I am your son. We are blood. I know I made a terrible mistake, but you have to help me. You have always helped me. Please, Dad. I am begging you. We are blood." I stood perfectly still, towering over the boy I had spent 42 years protecting. I looked down at him with eyes like solid ice. I did not feel a single trace of sorrow. I did not feel a single drop of parental guilt. I felt only the absolute clarity of a man who had finally excised a lethal tumor from his own life. "Blood makes you related, Preston," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling, perfectly even tone that silenced the entire room. "Loyalty makes you family." I picked up the forged medical evaluation and the devastating toxicology report from the marble counter, holding the undeniable proof of his murderous intentions directly in front of his face. "You stopped being my family the moment you watched your wife pour poison into my tea and eagerly waited for my mind to break." Preston sobbed very violently, bowing his head toward the floor, as the absolute finality of my words crushed the very last ounce of hope in his soul. I leaned down slightly, ensuring he heard my final, devastating truth. "Prison is the only place the syndicate cannot reach you," I then whispered coldly. "You should be thanking me for saving your life." I slowly stood back up and gave a very deliberate, sharp nod to the waiting lead federal agent. The stern officer grabbed his arms and pulled Preston roughly to his heavy feet. The fully armed strike team turned together and quickly began marching the two sobbing criminals out of my kitchen, dragging them forcefully down the long hallway, through the grand foyer, and out into the freezing night air. I stood entirely alone in the absolute pristine silence of my massive home, listening to the heavy front door finally slam shut, sealing my cold, unshakable victory completely and forever. 6 months have passed since that freezing night, when the federal agents took my son and his wife away in handcuffs. I am standing once again inside my study. For 12 long years, this room was a sealed tomb, a dark sanctuary dedicated exclusively to the overwhelming, suffocating grief of losing my beloved Mary. I used to keep the heavy oak door locked, because I was desperately afraid of facing the lingering ghosts of my past. Today, that heavy door is propped wide open. Bright, warm morning sunlight streams freely through the large bay windows, illuminating the polished mahogany desk and the vibrant Persian rug. I am no longer hiding in the shadows of my own home. I have fundamentally reclaimed my territory. I walked over to the reinforced wall safe and spun the mechanical dial. It is completely empty now. In the months following the spectacular collapse of Preston's criminal conspiracy, I made a series of massive permanent financial decisions. I liquidated the entirety of my commercial real estate portfolio, including the flagship downtown plaza that Preston had so desperately promised to his violent syndicate creditors. I did not keep those hundreds of millions of dollars for my own personal luxury or comfort. Instead, I established the Mary Harrison Foundation, a comprehensive legal and financial task force explicitly dedicated to protecting elderly individuals from severe familial exploitation and financial abuse. I took the very empire my son attempted to steal and transformed it into an impenetrable shield for those who cannot defend themselves against predators. I walked back to my desk and picked up my warm ceramic mug. I took a long, satisfying sip. It is a rich, dark roast black coffee. I have not allowed a single drop of chamomile tea into this house since the night I discovered the toxic truth. I turned my attention to the glowing television screen mounted on the far wall. The morning news anchor was delivering a brief update on a high-profile local court case. Preston and Victoria had both officially accepted federal plea deals late yesterday afternoon. They pleaded guilty to massive wire fraud, grand conspiracy, and attempted extortion, desperately hoping to avoid the maximum prison sentences. They are currently locked away in separate federal correctional facilities, completely stripped of their lavish lifestyles and their dangerous illusions of power. The violent underground syndicate, thoroughly neutralized by the massive federal scrutiny surrounding my son, completely dissolved into the shadows. I am entirely alone in this sprawling estate, but for the very first time in over a decade, I feel completely safe, infinitely powerful, and utterly at peace. I locked this room 12 years ago out of a paralyzing grief. I leave it wide open today out of an unshakable, hard-earned strength. The profound lesson I learned from this terrifying ordeal is one that many aging parents absolutely refuse to accept until it is far too late. Family is a beautiful privilege, but it is not a blind, unbreakable vulnerability. We spend our entire lives tirelessly building massive financial empires and accumulating wealth specifically to protect our bloodlines. We constantly assume that the greatest, most lethal threats to our safety will always come from the outside world. But human greed is a highly toxic, insidious poison that absolutely does not respect genetics or history. When the very people you raised, the people you fed and sheltered, decide to weaponize your paternal love and your advancing age directly against you, you must make a radical choice. You must immediately stop being a nurturing parent and start being a cold, calculating survivor. Forgiveness is certainly a noble and beautiful concept, but absolute self-preservation is a biological necessity. You must never allow deep sentimental attachments or the nostalgic memories of a happy childhood to blind you to the sharp blade of a knife aimed directly at your back. You can always love your family with your whole heart, but you must never, under any circumstances whatsoever, hand them the physical or digital keys to your own ultimate destruction. Have you ever experienced a shocking, devastating betrayal from someone you trusted implicitly with your life and your livelihood? How did you gather the necessary strength to fight back? Outsmart your enemies and finally reclaim your independence and your power. Please take a moment to share your own personal story in the comments section below. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more gripping true stories of ultimate survival and absolute justice. Thank you for listening to my journey today. I will see you all next time in the very next video. Stay safe out there, and always remember to protect your legacy above all else in this life.